Great. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Dole Institute. My name's Christina Luhn, and while I see some familiar faces here, there are a few that I don't recognize. I do have to give a great big shout out. I have two relatives here. Two cousins, Michael Gunn, who drove over from Kansas City, and Dr. Carnes, who drove over from Manhattan. So thank you. Today, our guest is Raul Rodriguez, but I'm going to do what I do when I begin each one of these, and that is kind of give just a quick overview of why I'm here in the first place and what the objective is of this series of discussions. And when I applied for this fellowship a year ago, I was very interested in helping people in other parts of the country understand the value of U.S.-Mexico relations. I just spent 7 years working on the U.S.-Mexico border on an economic development initiative, and one of the things that frustrated me so often was that those of us who really understood the value of strong relations with our neighbors ended up speaking to all of us who already understood this. So how do you help people in the other parts of the country who don't do that as a daily job? And so I applied for this fellowship so I could have an opportunity to bring experts in to talk to people in this part of the country, the Midwest, and for my experts to hear from people in the Midwest. Raul Rodriguez and I have known each other for, I don't know, 8 years?
More than that, yes.
10 years, and I met him in San Diego for the very first time on an initiative to reimagine the border. And so we have known each other since then. And when I conceptualized what this session would be, I immediately thought of Raul because he has had a long and interesting history of working on cross-border issues. Among other things, and he made me promise not to focus on this too much, but it impressed me, and that was he was the former CEO and managing director of the North American Development Bank, a bank that I suspect none of you, or very few of you, have ever heard of. And it was created, it's an infrastructure bank, primarily to fund projects on the U.S.-Mexico border, and it came out of NAFTA. And so you did that until 2005.
Yes.
But he's been doing a lot of other cross-border projects as well, and he's the current chairman of the U.S. Mexico Foundation. And when you listen, we've had lunch and dinner, and we've kind of caught up on what he's doing. I've been amazed by his travels and all of the projects that he's involved in. One of the reasons that I wanted to have Raul was because of the breadth and depth of knowledge of these relations, and because he had worked at an institution that had been created as a result of NAFTA. He brings kind of this historical perspective, kind of the long view, how have things changed since NAFTA's beginning. But before we get into all of that, I always ask a few kind of more personal questions from my guests. And first off, can you tell me a little bit about you?
Well, I thank you, Christina, to begin with. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you. Christina is a dear friend, and I have great respect for what she's done in a number of fields, among others, making sure that we build the kinds of bridges that are constructive between both sides of the border. And she did that for a number of years based in San Diego, and she's always kept abreast and involved in bringing our two countries together. So I greatly appreciate what she does in that and other fields. I was born in Mexico, came to the States as a student, studied at Harvard, went back to Mexico, then worked in Canada, studied some additional time in Europe, and eventually settled in Texas. I've been living in San Antonio for the past 22 years, and most of my business activities, I'm involved in the health and energy sectors, are in San Antonio. I've also kept some presence along the years in the academic world. I chaired a center at Arizona State University for 7 or 8 years, having to do with North American affairs, logistics, energy, and the likes, all related to business. And today what I do is a combination of things. I should be taking care of my grandchildren, but I've been remiss as of late. I spend part of my time with Monterrey Tech. Monterrey Tech is the largest private sector institution in Latin America, with 60 campuses all over Mexico, plus an additional presence in terms of programs throughout Latin America. It is the equivalent of the MIT for Latin America. It's the best engineering school. I'm very proud. It's my alma mater. Before I went to Harvard, I studied at Monterrey Tech and then taught there early on in my career. And the chairman of the board is an old classmate of mine, and he invited me back to help them revamp their international strategy. As far as we know, and there aren't that many rankings in this regard, but Monterrey Tech is the #1 institution in the world in terms of student exchange. As we speak, we have over 10,000 of our students studying abroad, and we have close to 5,000 foreign students in our different campuses. So from day one, it's SACS accredited. It has a direct presence in the U.S. in many ways. From day one, this is a 75-year-old institution. It has had this international character. So what they asked me to do is to help them revamp that and take it to a next level. As an example, we are investing in the new MIT Nanotech Lab, which has been built as we speak. It'll be complete next year. I was just there for one of the ceremonies leading into the final completion of the lab. And that's very exciting, and we have a substantial amount of money from our perspective invested in it, and I believe by now we're the #1 foreign institution investing in their nanotech lab. It is an important component of MIT, so to the extent that it has been located in the courtyard of the main building, of the building that's been there for 100 years. They celebrated the centennial last year. So we're proud to be a core partner of MIT. Our chairman is now part of their board, of the board of the MIT Corporation, so it's that close. I'm also pushing for a strong relationship with UT Austin. We have a joint MBA program, which is the most successful executive MBA program in Latin America. We have an honors program with Yale. We have programs with Berkeley, with Stanford, with Oxford, and so on and so forth. So I'm proud to be part of my alma mater's next step in terms of its international approach to things. I'm also the chair of the international board of the Hart Research Institute, which is the largest marine biology and marine ecosystem center in the Gulf of Mexico, based at Texas A&M, out of Corpus Christi. I chair the U.S. Mexico Foundation in New York City, and this is a foundation that's doing connections in terms of young leaders between Mexico and the U.S., and also taking to Mexico best practices in terms of education and civic engagement and leadership. For example, we were the first sponsors of Teach for America in Mexico. We were the first sponsors of SKIP schools in Mexico, things like that. So again, that's a bit of what I do and what I've done.
So a Renaissance man with wide-ranging interests.
I'm only 35, and this is how I look. Lots of miles in Southwestern United.
So in the time that you were at the NAD Bank and after, well, let's quickly just kind of deal with, what did you do at the NAD Bank?
The NAD Bank was the only institution as a spin-off of the North American Free Trade Agreement of NAFTA. And the NAD Bank was meant to cater to issues, lags in terms of infrastructure along the U.S.-Mexico border, on both sides of the border. I'll give you an example, wastewater, water, solid waste management. There were lags by the time that NAFTA was being negotiated and signed. This is 23 years ago. So it was, needless to say, to be expected that these lags would be, there would be a lot more pressure on them because of the fact that we expected the border to grow, because of NAFTA and because of the dynamics that were already there. So it was decided in the context of the NAFTA negotiations that we needed a bank. So that's the bank that I headed. During my time, I was the CEO for 5 years. For example, I was involved in financing over 100 water and wastewater projects along the border on both sides. So that's essentially what it does. It does environmental infrastructure. That's the main focus. That's the priority. And it does studies in terms of the pressure on urban communities because of the fact that trade and investment flows are growing in the region.
Well, that's a good segue into the larger issues of the relationship between U.S. and Mexico. And again, one of my expressed interests is to help people who haven't worked on these issues closely to understand why people in Kansas should care about Mexico and why we should have good neighbors, care about our neighbors. So the impact of trade on the border and by extension the rest of the country, what have you seen change or evolve in terms of U.S.-Mexican relations since the beginning of NAFTA and your time at the subsequent at the NAD Bank?
Well, if I take it back to the beginning of my involvement in border affairs and U.S.-Mexico affairs, there's been a dramatic transformation in terms of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Those of us who live close to the border, like San Antonio, or Houston, or Austin, or Dallas, recognize that easily because our economies are, to a certain extent, very much related to that, to what happens with Mexico. But if I could just take 1 minute to suggest why in Kansas it's important to keep abreast and involved in terms of this relationship, I'll just mention the following facts. As of last year, Mexico became Kansas' #1 export partner. So you're selling more to Mexico than you're selling to China or Canada. In the case of Texas, we're selling more to Mexico than to the sum total of the following 16 partners. That includes China, Canada, a good number of countries in Europe and Asia and so forth. In the case of the U.S., Mexico is the second trading partner after Canada, the second destination of our exports. And it's equivalent, as you can see in that slide over there, to the sum total of China, Japan, plus Korea, plus South Korea, or to the 6 main trading partners in Europe. What we sell to Mexico is more than what we sell to the UK, plus Germany, plus the Netherlands, plus Belgium, plus France. 30% more than what we sell to the rest of Latin America. That includes Brazil. So, you know, we seldom recognize the relevance of the relationship. And I like to say that we can all be against undocumented immigration, and we can all be against a number of things that happen. But still, I think, even though we're against that, we can recognize the importance, the relevance of what's happening from a business standpoint and from other standpoints in terms of the importance of that. But going back to your question, that hasn't been so historically. We come from a rather difficult, I dare say, convoluted history of bilateral relations. You can go back 200 years in terms of our independent life, in the case of Mexico and in the case of the U.S. And it hasn't been easy, to the extent that we fought a war, 1846 to 1848. Mexico, for a number of reasons, mostly folly on the Mexican side, but you know, there's additional reasons, lost 57% of its territory to the U.S. good number of states in the Southwest were Mexico before that time. And you go on, and in 1914, we had the Marines in Veracruz. 1917, you had Pershing in Chihuahua, and we can go on and on. So as you can imagine, as we move forward to, let's say, the 1980s, as recent as the early 1990s, this was a story of on the one hand, some level of resentment, very much present in the way the Mexican side dealt with the U.S., and I dare say a lot of neglect on the side of the U.S. vis-a-vis Mexico. Suddenly NAFTA happens, and we can go into that at another moment, but the point is that it has served as a platform to re-engage from both sides. Not sufficiently, and I dare say that because of what's happening as of late. But it has changed the equation, dramatically so. And it has changed the equation partly because it has produced this level of interaction from an economic standpoint. And it's a win-win. We can say a lot about jobs that have been lost in the States, and that is true. I mean, there's some displacement in different fields, in different regions of the country, in different sectors. And we have been remiss on the U.S. side in terms of dealing with that, meaning how do you retrain, how do you help adjust in communities and sectors that have been affected. We've done very little of that. That's one of the things that we need to take care of. But having said that, net, there has been job growth. And that's been well studied. And I think it's been particularly concentrated in sectors and regions where you find 21st century kind of sectors growing and making progress. So altogether, what you see is increased cooperation. Let me wrap up this long answer with one example of the level of cooperation that we see today that we neglect to appreciate, perhaps, but that's very real, very tangible, and that makes a huge difference from the way we dealt with things 20, 30 years ago and before that. El Chapo Guzman, you'll recall that name. He is one of the most sought-after drug dealers in the world. At a given point in time, he was #1 in the FBI list. El Chapo Guzman was captured in Mexico after a number of attempts and after having been in prison a couple of times and had escaped in the Mexican side. And he was extradited early this year to the U.S., and he is now serving in a prison in southern Manhattan, northern Manhattan, I'm sorry. That would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Politically in Mexico, it would have been a big no-no for a host of reasons, but mostly because of a rather entrenched vision with regards to what sovereignty is all about. It was a no-no. I mean, how could we possibly in Mexico extradite someone of this caliber to the U.S.? He's ours, he's our prisoner. Today, the reasonable thing to do from all standpoints was he should be serving in the U.S., and he is serving in the U.S. So just as an example of the kinds of things that we don't recognize on a daily basis, but had changed dramatically over the years. I should be giving more positive examples, but on the negative side of things, it stands out.
But it's still an example
Sure.
of the ways in which cooperation have improved. And because security is an important piece of our relationship. So quickly kind of thinking about the NAD Bank and how it's changed, or the management in terms of what its original mission was and what are the needs today. Has it kept up?
Very much so. It's grown, and it's grown in terms of coverage and the new sectors. It's involved now, for example, in clean energy, which we didn't do back then. Yeah, it's evolved very positively. To the extent, that the Trump administration is considering increasing the capital, its contribution to the capital, which is good news.
What about other aspects of border management? You know, I met you during this group that had come together from both sides of the border to kind of reimagine the border. And one of the things that came out of that was this idea of, well, we're the 21st century, we needed 21st century border management. What does that mean?
Well, the epitome of the opportunities and the challenges of the bilateral relationship lie along the border. This is a 2,000-mile border where you have the record number of border crossings in the world, both in terms of people and in terms of merchandise. You have Laredo, which is the largest inland port in all of the Americas, except, I believe, at given points in time, Windsor. But you know, most of the time it's Laredo. In any event, it's a border that is tremendously active and tremendously challenging. The management of the border, therefore, is a huge challenge, among other things because that vision of sovereignty that I described in terms of El Chapo changing at a federal level hasn't exactly changed in some instances, and that has to do, among other things, with the border itself, border management itself. And I think it's imperative that we change this, we continue changing this, making progress in modernizing it, because we're dealing not only with business and economic opportunities, which is important enough, we're also dealing with scarce resources that we share. When you're thinking of communities as large as El Paso and Juarez across the line, you're thinking communities that are in arid regions with huge challenges in terms of water availability, for example. And as of today, we still manage water resources the way we managed them in the 1940s, when you have a totally different environmental and demographic reality and economic reality in that region and in the world in general. So it behooves us on both sides of the border to figure out new ways of dealing things. We are a lot more efficient in the Canadian, on the Canadian side of the equation. We have the International Joint Committee managing joint water resources in a way that we are far from doing in the U.S. Mexico side of things.
So, you know, one of the most interesting elements of this for me, and what I wanted to share with everyone here, was your perspective on what you think are the key issues today that define U.S.-Mexico relations.
I'd say the main ones are obvious. It's trade and economic interdependence, or interaction, if you like. It's immigration, and it's security. Those three dominate the agenda, rightly so. If I had to summarize in a nutshell how we're doing, immigration, we tend to think that is the same situation we had 15, 20 years ago, and things have truly changed. For example, today, because of security, which has been revamped along the border on our side, meaning border patrol technology, and the fact that we already have a wall in about a third of the border. We keep talking about let's build a wall. Well, we built a wall in the most critical parts of the border over the past 20 years, and it works. So for a host of reasons, immigration from Mexico, I'm talking about illegal, undocumented immigration from Mexico, has decreased substantially. And these are U.S. figures. I'm not talking about Mexican statistics. These are U.S. figures. If you analyze, for example, a related indicator, which is apprehensions on the side of the Border Patrol from Mexicans, they've dropped substantially. To the extent that Jeffrey Passell and other demographers have estimated over the past 7 or 8 years, that net immigration from Mexico, illegal immigration, is negative, meaning we're sending people back on the net. The issues that we face today in the U.S. on immigration have to do mostly with Central America, folks coming in from El Salvador, Honduras, and other places. Once again, it behooves us in the U.S. to cooperate with Mexico, because you would rather do as much as possible in terms of stemming that flow on the southern border of Mexico than doing it over here. So one reason that we should rethink immigration issues when we think, how should we react? Trade, I already described the situation. I'll just give you some local stats. I mentioned this in passing, but I brought this up at the interview this morning, the radio interview. Think of Kansas as a company and having international trade, business deals. Well, Kansas has approximately $10 billion business with international companies, ultimately with countries around the world, 10 billion. Out of that, almost 20% of that last year was done with Mexico. But not only that, our exports to Mexico grew last year from Kansas, 5%. Our exports to Canada and our exports to China decreased 25% last year. So, not only doing good, but doing better. And if you add to that what kind of things we're trading with Mexico, it's not only grain and meat, which is fantastic. Christina was just telling me that all of the corn exported from Kansas goes to Mexico. Well, but it's not only that, it's aircraft and equipment, and there's a lot of value added in terms of what we sell to Mexico. But not only that, on top of all of this, if you take into account what we buy and we sell from China, for example, we have a deficit with China in Kansas of over $1.6 billion. That means we buy a lot more from China than we sell. In the case of Mexico, we have a surplus of over $1 billion last year, meaning we sell more to Mexico than we buy from them. If we were discussing business, this would be a customer that I would be fully keeping abreast with, and at the very least, being careful in terms of how we deal with that relationship and building as much as possible on the positive side of things. So again, immigration, security, trade are, in my view, the three more important areas of opportunity and challenge in the bilateral relationship. But I dare say that if you take a look at the whole picture, I would underline the opportunity side of the equation.
So one of the, backing up a second and kind of talking about this wall, since you're not an official of any government at this point, you can
I'm an engineer, but I have nothing to do with the wall.
That's right. So what do you think of the president's approach to Mexico? And
well, let me start with the wall.
Okay. And
I'll be bold.
Yes, you'll be bold.
And by what?
And by extension, kind of the whole discussion around the wall, which is really during the campaign, what kind of jump-started a lot of attention to Trump's ideas about relations with Mexico.
Well, let me be very straightforward here. I'm most probably right of center politically, individually. I'm fiscal conservative, to a certain extent, social liberal. But in any event, I understand where the president's coming from. I fully understand why the campaign evolved the way it did. He won, so it worked. While I fully understand the reasons why the vote happened the way it did, and it has to do with the way that the economy, particularly the economy, has been evolving over the past few years. It was a vote of class more than anything else. It was a vote of income level more than anything else. I'm not talking about the lower part of the income ladder. I'm talking about middle class. And I'm talking about a huge swath of land and regions along the central part of the country. So that's fully understandable where we're coming from. The thing is that the tone, the emphasis doesn't make much sense, doesn't solve things to begin with. Let's start with, and I'll get to the wall in a minute. Let's start with job loss. Job loss in the US, and there's a number of studies that are serious about this, is due mostly because of automation and technology. It has very little to do with free trade. So blaming free trade for job loss is, to say the least, an overstatement. Number two, as I mentioned, on the net, we're doing okay in terms of free trade. But beyond that, when you go into immigration, once again, I already mentioned the fact that this is not an issue with Mexico. So portraying this as Mexico sending us rapists and so forth, the way it was stated, just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't contribute, needless to say, to building the kind of relationship that I think behooves both sides. And I just mentioned trade facts that are there in that slide with regards to Kansas. That would prove the point. But let me forget all of that. Let me put that aside, all the moral, strategic considerations, and boil it down to cost effectiveness. A dear friend of mine is my congressman in San Antonio. He's from my district. Will Hurd. Will spent, among other things, 9 years in the CIA, working in Afghanistan and other places. His business is security. He has built a business in terms of providing security advice and solutions. So the guy knows what he's talking about. This is his statement, I'm quoting. The wall is a 13th century solution to a 21st century issue. He's absolutely right. No. Why emphasize something that just doesn't make sense? Gets you some votes? Needless to say, I would agree that it worked. But we're now in the business of government. We're in a different phase. Let's be serious. It just doesn't work. I don't deny that we need a bit more wall here or there, but thinking of let's do a 2,000-mile wall, well, once again, 768 miles of border wall are already built. And they're precisely along the lines of efficiency because they're located where it makes a difference. And where it makes a difference, by the way, is where it's cheaper to build a wall because it's where people usually cross. So, you have all of the California portion and then a good portion of Arizona and New Mexico, but you don't have the portions where you have complications from either an urban perspective or a landscape perspective. So if we continue along the lines of let's do this because it was a campaign promise, we're going to be spending a lot of taxpayers' money in a way that just doesn't work. When, among other things, you have the option of doing more of what has worked over the past 20 years, which is more technology and more investment in Border Patrol. So once again, beyond philosophical, moral, or relationship considerations that I could add to, there's a very down-to-earth, basic discussion in terms of cost effectiveness that we haven't had, at least enough. So I would go back to Will in terms of saying, we're discussing a Chinese approach from the 13th century to an issue of the 21st century. It doesn't make sense. Once again, former CIA operative, extremely bright and Republican. And my quote.
Kind of not switching gears, but kind of stepping across the border for you and all of your friends and former colleagues and just people that you know generally in Mexico. How have they perceived the whole election cycle and then Trump coming in as president and the continued rhetoric?
Well, as you can imagine, there's an element in the subconscious of the Mexican people that still relates to that anti-American feeling that was quite prevalent until maybe 25, 30 years ago, and that, as I described, has evolved dramatically, substantially, fortunately, under NAFTA in a considerable way. So whenever something like this happens, where you have all this rhetorical approach to Mexico, immigrants, what have you, the wall, they're going to pay for it, it doesn't help. It brings back those sentiments. And the litmus test to that is, I keep in touch with, for example, my high school friends from Mexico. And they're businessmen, they're conservative, I can't find one single radical among them, on the left at least. So we're not talking to any biased group here at all. And yet they're, to say the least, annoyed with the tone. And I think rightly so. And once again, what for? Is it a matter of keeping your constituencies happy and at bay? You're going to keep them happy in other ways. I mean, they're there. Once again, the election is over. We're in the active government. I find hope in the sense that in some areas that were contentious during the campaign, like NAFTA, we're moving forward. As we speak, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, there's public hearings in Washington, D.C., convened by the federal government with regards to NAFTA. And the kind of people that I see registered as speakers and conveying their thoughts and their papers and their speeches and so forth, it's a very reasonable bunch. I think it's going to be very productive. So I'm hopeful that, at least on the NAFTA side of things, we're going to move forward with a positive negotiation. By the way, we needed a revision of NAFTA. It's been almost 25 years since we wrapped up the negotiation. It's been 23 years since it's been in place. It's about time that we review that free trade agreement. Not because of the fact that it isn't working. I think that the numbers are stark clear in terms of how productive it is, but in terms of what it doesn't cover. It doesn't cover e-commerce. It didn't exist back then. It doesn't cover all of the internet realm at all, which is a fundamental component of what we do today in terms of international business relations. It doesn't cover energy, because back then it was a big no-no for Mexico. Today it isn't. I mean, there's an energy reform in place in Mexico. We could move in that direction. I think there's a lot of hope for complementarity beyond what we already have in energy and in North America in general, including Canadians. Oh, there's a number of different elements. We could revamp what was done in terms of intellectual property rights, which we could definitely improve. You name it. I mean, there's a long list of things that should be reviewed, but the tone doesn't help. I mean, I think we need to review that. I think the cabinet has been very adamant. Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce, and others, Secretary of Energy, former governor of Texas, and very friendly with Mexico. All of these people, in one way or another, have done business with Mexico over the past 25 years, and they know of the importance of the relationship. And I think they're shifting the tone, and I think the president is reacting to that. So I'm an optimist in terms of where this is going.
Is there a need to get these negotiations completed in a quick manner? Why?
That is an issue because the calendar in 2018 doesn't help. You have a presidential election in Mexico coming up in July of next year, change of government in 1st of December of next year, and it's going to be complicated. There's a certain level of popularity of rather populist alternatives in Mexico that wouldn't help Mexico, wouldn't help us, and wouldn't help the relationship. So 2018 is going to be delicate on the Mexican side. But we have midterms in the U.S. We have the end of what's called fast-track authority for the government on July 1st, which always is crucial in terms of negotiating.
And fast-track is?
It's the ability for the executive branch to send to Congress a draft proposal, a bill, a draft for anything in the trade realm, in the economic realm, and for Congress simply to say yes or no. not to modify it. And if you don't take advantage of that authority, you go into periods in Congress that would open up Pandora's box. Everyone going in for their own piece of interest in terms of changing or establishing a trade deal. So it's crucial that we do this in the context of this kind of authority on the side of Congress with regards to the executive branch. So for all these reasons, we have a very limited time frame ahead of us to renegotiate. That spells essentially end of the year, beginning of 2018. If we go beyond that, it gets extremely complicated, and we don't want that. So, in other words, what I'm hearing from my friends who are participating in the negotiation from both sides, and from the Canadian side, is that they're going to go for the low-hanging fruit, do as much as possible, close it up, hopefully by the end of the year, and then pick it up again 2019, which makes a lot of sense. What's available short-term? The more obvious things, rules of origin, which means domestic content that's allowed for each product if you are to gain access to the rules and advantages of the deal. Things like that can be done. They don't need legislative approval. Doesn't take a lot of time. It's relatively easy things. But it will show a dynamic. It will show a commitment on the side of the three governments to review the trade deal. So from a political standpoint, that's important. And once again, it will not complicate things if we move in that direction. If we don't, if for some reason someone is obstinate and thinks we can revamp the whole thing, then it's going to be extremely complicated, and we'll end up with who knows what.
So beyond the obvious trade benefits that you've just outlined and that we've discussed before, and the security, what do you see that have been the other benefits of this cooperation? I mean, how do trade relationships like a NAFTA improve other kinds of relationships beyond security, which is really important?
Quite frankly, I don't think Mexico would have improved its political situation the way it has if it hadn't been for NAFTA. It's a bold statement, and a lot of people will argue against it, but let me try to explain. Needless to say, if you look at Mexico today, there's tremendous lags. Impunity, corruption, rampant, security is a huge issue. Efficiency in government is very much a to-do. You name it. I mean, I wouldn't present the Mexican case as an example of best practices in government and politics. But if you analyze the evolution of electoral politics over the past 80 years, in fact, if you go back to independence in Mexico, the first 30 years of an independent Mexico from 1821 to 1851, Mexico had, if I'm not mistaken, 47 changes in government. This was a country that, for a host of reasons that we don't have time to get into, was born in a highly unstable political foundation. And you know, we could go the way that Octavio Paz and others went in terms of describing how the roots behind our two versions of Western civilization, as he called it, Octavio Paz, who, by the way, taught here many years ago, before he got the Nobel Prize. The two roots of Western civilization, to a certain extent, explain the contrast in political foundations and institutions on both sides of the border. You had Reformation, Luther, you had colonization, you had a whole philosophical approach based on the Enlightenment in the case of the foundation of the U.S. as we know it today. I mean, let alone Native Americans, that's a different story, but in terms of the bulk of the American experience today. By contrast, you had counter-reformation, you had conquest, you have mestizaje, the mix of, the blend of races. You have a number of different elements, including the neo-Thomist philosophy dominating the Mexican and Latin American experience. In other words, signs of Luther and Felipe II suddenly finding themselves as neighbors. Well, it goes without saying that, however that might be a bit of hyperbole, no, there's a substance to that. There's elements of that that explain the different ways that we interact as societies and that we operate as societies. Okay, long story, to bring it back to today. NAFTA opened Mexico to the world. 50 years ago, total foreign trade in Mexico vis-a-vis the size of its economy was about 20%. Today, it's close to 75%. That's a description in a nutshell of how Mexico has opened its economy. If I were to extrapolate with similar stories around the world, in terms of what's happened in the Asian tigers and what's happened with Chile and with other examples, and some, obviously, some good examples in Europe, there's a correlation between opening up your economy and opening up your politics, your political system. And that has worked well in Mexico. Again, it's an unfinished business. What we see in Mexico is an unfinished transition, to say the least. And there's lags and challenges all over the place. But the level of discussion, to say the least, to put it, I mean, to just bring up one example, that you see today in Mexico, the level of participation and the way you participate in elections is unprecedented. Mexico had 71 years of one single party ruling the country, the PRI and its previous versions, from 1929 until 2000. So it's still a young democracy, but we can call it much more a democracy today than what we could have called it 20 years ago. Actually, Mario Vargas Llosa dubbed it in 1993 the imperfect dictatorship. Well, whatever you call it, it wasn't exactly a democracy back then. It's not exactly a democracy now, but it's a lot better. So that would be the connection I would establish between NAFTA and what's happening.
Well, what kind of, well, let's talk for a second since you mentioned the upcoming election.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Who's going to win? I don't know. No bets.
So you don't know who's going to win, but you do have a sense of who are the candidates that are on the horizon and what they might mean for relations with continued improving relationships between the countries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the obvious name that pops up in every conversation is Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Andrés Manuel is, I'd say, center-left, but beyond geometry, he is very much a populist. This is his third run for the presidency. Some people would say that he actually won first time around. Officially, he lost by half a percentage point back then. This is 2006. Then in 2012, he ran again, and once again, he didn't end up as well as he did 6 years before, but he still suggests that it wasn't exactly clean. Anyway, he's a persistent man. Needless to say, that would be an attribute that I would underscore. But he is a man that is very much engaged in the past. He was a priista. He was part of the PRI in his youth up until a certain point in time when he wasn't the candidate for the governorship in his state, and he parted ways with the PRI. Some people would suggest that the challenge here is akin to what Venezuela faced 20 years ago. I'd like to think that it's not that bad. I don't think López Obrador is a Chavez or a Maduro. But I don't think either that he would continue building on some of the positive things that we've dealt with in the U.S.-Mexico relationship and in Mexico specifically over the years. He is catering, unfortunately, to very real issues and woes and complaints and concerns of the people. He is emphasizing the fact that, once again, there's a huge issue in terms of corruption and impunity and so forth and insecurity. But what I see from him is not exactly the example of a squeaky clean option. You know? So I'm concerned with that. My concern goes further, and that is I don't see any clear leadership emerging in the other parties, you know, anywhere else, let alone independent potential candidates. And the PRI, which is still the majority, holds the majority in Congress and in governorships and the presidency, is tainted by how the current presidency has evolved over the years. So that doesn't help, and I don't think they have a strong candidate in their field that could win against López Obrador. So what people are saying is that we will see some sort of coalition emerge over the next few months, propelled by all of those who oppose López Obrador. If the election were to be held today, and that would be an unfair exercise in terms of imagination, because there's no formal candidates in the other parties, and Andrés Manuel is obviously the candidate in his party, and he's the founder, by the way, so he controls all the strings. But if the election were held today, just as an exercise of biased imagination, he would win, according to polls. So, no, it's still an eternity away. It's a year away. But same time, the candidates need to be registered, if I'm not mistaken, in March. So we need to be seeing the alternatives quite soon in the political fray.
I know that you have written an article sometime this past year, and you used the title from a book that was written by Alan Riding, and Distant Neighbor, from the Mexican perspective of looking at the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. Why is that called Distant Neighbor? I mean, what was Alan Riding getting at? And is the U.S. still a distant neighbor of Mexico?
No. It goes back to my description as to how this relationship has evolved. Alan Riding was the New York Times correspondent in Mexico in the 1980s, and he published this book in 1985, 32 years ago. And the title was perfect. It was the description of neighbors that were completely distant, not only from a cultural standpoint, but from any effective element of the daily life between two countries and two neighbors in this case, be that economic, security, immigration, you name it. And it was well reviewed at the time and was a very popular book, and gave us all a sense of what was happening, or rather what wasn't happening between the two sides. If you reread that book today, starting with the title itself, you would say, we have come a long way. To the extent that we're strategic partners, no. But to the extent that we're not distant neighbors anymore.
You know, much of the past 6 months, the campaign and into the new year, once Trump became president, you know, we've talked a lot about what have been the concerns within the U.S. in terms of our relationship with Mexico. So kind of probing that a little bit more, from a Mexican perspective, you know, when you talk to your friends or you read the press, what are their concerns beyond Trump himself with relations with the U.S.?
beyond what's going to be this morning's tweet.
Yes.
I would go back to what I mentioned in terms of the key sectors. I think we fully agree on both sides of the border that these are the main areas of concern, and once again, I would underscore, of opportunity. It's the economic side of the relationship, the business, it's security, and it's immigration. I think that once you go beyond the rhetoric and beyond the tweeting here and there, you find, at least among the main actors of in terms of leadership on both sides of the border, of putting together the relationship or continuing to put together a relationship and manage it, I see level heads. I see people really continuing with the kind of business that we've dealt with over the past few years. It's not like, I know the foreign affairs minister in Mexico used to be my advisor at the NatBank. The minister of trade in Mexico used to be my partner in arms when we were negotiating NAFTA. We used to travel all over the States. By the way, Mexico did a stellar job in terms of informing what Mexico was all about and what NAFTA was all about in 1992, 93, 94, 1992 and 93. And Ildefonso Guajardo, who is now the trade minister in Mexico, and I used to drive all over the place. We were here in Kansas City, by the way, and debating AFL-CIO and different groups, and different interest groups were voicing their interests and concerns at the time. So these people know what it's all about. They've been through times that are difficult, and the report that I get from these folks is we're moving forward. And again, the concerns have to do with the timing and the substance of the renegotiation of NAFTA, but you don't hear anything, for example, as of late, meaning over the past, 5 months, with regards to security. I mean, we continue to cooperate there. And I gave the example of El Chapo. El Chapo was extradited a few days before President Trump took office. So it's not like, okay, now President Trump is going to take office and we're not talking to each other at all. Same is true in terms of immigration, in terms of reinforcing the border, except again for the fact that suddenly you Mexicans are going to pay for the wall, and that doesn't bode well on the Mexican side, and so on and so forth. That does that, but these are exceptions to the rule in terms of what's happening. I'm not alarmed at all in terms of the state of the bilateral relationship, and I'm speaking with the Mexican perspective of my friends over there in mind. Tone, that's a different story. Okay? Substance, I don't see a problem.
Was there, just quickly, was there the kind of questions and issues and concerns in Mexico around the passage of NAFTA?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the case of the U.S., it was essentially not knowing what this was all about, meaning not only NAFTA, but Mexico itself. In the case of Mexico, we had that baggage of cultural mindset that was there for centuries, and the beginning. And it's the big bad wolf. We're trying to make a deal with the big bad wolf. It's not going to work. They're going to gobble us, and so on and so forth. Which, of course, didn't happen. And it works both ways. I mean, Mexico is doing tremendous business over here. It's a very balanced trade relationship, by the way. Let me put it this way. If I were campaigning in the U.S., God forbid, but if I were, I would emphasize the issues that we have with China. Those are serious issues. The trade deficit that we have with China is 5.5 times larger than the one we have in Mexico. 5.5 times. Have you heard anything about the deficit? Very little. What do we keep hearing about? Oh, that crazy deficit with Mexico that's grown because of NAFTA. It's 0.3% of GDP, 0.3% of the size of the U.S. economy. That's the size of the deficit. We have a tremendously balanced and productive and growing relationship on the trade side of things with Mexico and Canada. It's a great relationship for all sides. It's a win-win-win. Let's not undo that. Now, once again, well, the previous slide, we're selling more to Mexico than to the sum total of all the different groups that I mentioned. That with a very small deficit. What's wrong with that? And that's supporting 5.5, 6 million jobs in the US, net. Not bad. Plus a lot of other things. I mean, Bentonville is not that far away from here. I'm a good friend of Sam Walton III. Walmart has 220,000 employees in Mexico. It's the #1 private employer in Mexico. It has 28,000 domestic suppliers in Mexico. It has 2,400 stores. It's a win-win. It works. And that's just an example, and that's exactly the most popular example. I mean, I could bring up, dairy farming. The largest dairy producer in the US, bought Borden some years ago, is Lala. It's based in Torreon, Mexico. The owner is a board member in my foundation in New York. Great news.
I just want to, you mentioned China, and even though this is all about U.S.-Mexico relations, to ignore China on the horizon I think is problematic. From your perspective, because you do travel a lot and you operate in a variety of groups who are international in their perspective, and recently the U.S. opted not to follow through on another rather large trade deal called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I know Mexico actually wanted it very much. And there are people within the U.S. who wanted it as well. There was a belief that by the U.S. not becoming engaged in the TPP, that it opens up, it makes it much easier for China to continue to kind of expand its influence, not just economically, but politically. Does China have, what's China's relationship in Mexico?
All right. Let me give you two answers. One is TPP. I published a piece in Washington from a business standpoint on TPP 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, when it was just starting, the negotiation. I think it's a missed opportunity. I think we should have reviewed and maybe tweaked this or that, but it was an opportunity to take free trade deals in the direction that President Trump is suggesting, which is, let's make this a lot more fair to the U.S. It was a great opportunity to do that. I think we were geared in that direction. And again, tweaking this or that would have taken care of that, rather than rejecting the whole thing. It opened an opportunity for China to position itself in the international fray. I'm not that concerned. I don't think they're going to be effective at that. There's a lot of rejection to that possibility in Asia itself. So that's not an issue. But in any event, it did project China as, okay, so now we're the unipolar leader in the world. You wish. Anyway, I think it was a mistake. In and of itself, it was a mistake. By the way, it would have taken care of most of the concerns that we have with NAFTA.
Meaning?
Subsumed, for example, rules of origin and so forth. It would, intellectual property rights. It would have revamped NAFTA without having to open NAFTA. Okay, so anyway, missed opportunity. I don't think they're going to pick it up again, but if they do, which is highly unlikely, it would be a positive move. Okay, so that's one thing. In terms of China suddenly taking over the dominant relationship in Mexico, that's posturing on the Mexican side, on the Chinese side. Just take a look at foreign trade from Mexico, exports from Mexico. 81+% of Mexican exports come to the U.S. Slightly over 1% go to China. what do you hear from some folks in Mexico? Oh, you know, we're going to substitute the U.S. with China. Well, good luck. I mean, it's going to take about 100 years. I don't think you have the political patience to do it. That's not the point. That's not the way out. I mean, we have a productive relationship in North America. Let's continue building it. That's my point. And the phrase I like to use in our case in the U.S. is some enlightened self-interest would be a great use. Meaning, let's just not be unnecessarily rough in the relationship. Let's be enlightened and keep our interests in mind.
So we're going to start questions in just a moment, but I want one final question myself, and that is, I know you can't predict the future, but do you, in terms of the U.S.-Mexico relations, but having said that, you do have enough perspective. Are you optimistic? How would you summarize U.S.-Mexico relationship to date going forward?
Well, it's obvious that I would disagree with part of the stance from President Trump. In a rather haphazard way, I think that some of the things that he's pushing for will at the end work out okay. I think what's happening in the case of, and by the way, this thought comes from 10 days I spent a couple of months ago in Israel, and then a convening in Buenos Aires that I was in a couple of weeks before that, and traveling around the world and getting a sense of what people are feeling. And in the case of Mexico, I did say in a rather haphazard way this will help, because it's underscoring the need to do two things that we were completely remiss in over the past 25 years. One is making sure, and I mentioned this in passing a few minutes ago, making sure that we cater to the groups of the population, sectors of the economy, regions of the country that do not benefit from opening up the borders. And these are the more traditional sectors and regions in the country. Once again, more affected by far by the evolution of technology and globalization than with free trade itself. But needless to say, we're in debt in terms of catering to those groups. And there's ways to do it, and the more obvious one is we need to revamp and reinvest in retraining. There's a lot of re's there, but we need to invest in retraining dramatically as fast as possible. And our community colleges are ready for that, and most of the universities are already taking the lead. So we're moving in that direction. We need to do it faster. And once again, it goes far beyond NAFTA and free trade. It has to do with how the business practices alone are changing. When did we ever imagine that we would be doing the Ubers and Airbnbs and so forth and Amazons of our daily consumer experiences that we're doing today? Well, that spells what's being called the fourth industrial revolution. It's a complete revamping of our economies and our business practices. We need to prepare for that. Again, with NAFTA, without NAFTA, we're going to have to do that. That's one point. The second thing that I think this whole environment will propel and somehow compel us to do more is we need to explain what's happening. We need for the constituents of NAFTA and all these things to go out and describe this. What's the proportion of the population in Kansas that's aware of this in regards to the relationship with Mexico? I would dare bet that a small proportion. We're not fully engaged with things that are fundamental for our current economic situation and social situation and our future. Making a better case for the kinds of positive things that are happening is important. And what you do here at the university and at the institute is clearly a component of that.
So are you optimistic?
I did sound optimistic.
Yes.
No, I am. I'm a lot more optimistic with with the situation than, you know, a lot of people I talk to.
Well, good. All right, are there any questions?
I'm rather curious
Oh,
about.
could you hold just a moment, please?
Oh.
It's okay. There.
I talk so loudly, I knew I wouldn't need it. I'm really curious about how having so many American plants operating in Mexico to make things more cheaply has affected the Mexico-U.S. relations. I know Trump wishes they would come back to the lower 48 to operate. How would Mexico feel if he were able to talk everybody into coming back to the U.S.?
That's a great question. Number one, I don't think he will. I don't think he can. We just saw a decision by Ford, not with regards to Mexico, with regards to China, expanding operations over there. So I think business imperatives are going to, at the end of the day, be dominant. And interests will be dominant in terms of decisions of this sort. What have we seen so far? What is it? 2,000 jobs coming back? Needless to say, very well portrayed from a political standpoint. And I don't blame them for that. I mean, I would be doing the same thing. The carriers of the world. Doesn't add up too much. And I don't think that again, will be affected. What kind of incentives can you establish? You know, there's a number of them, mostly on the fiscal side of things. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight. What kind of disincentives, punishment can you establish? None that I can think of that would work effectively for the U.S. economy overall. So, you know, for all practical purposes, I don't think that's going to go far. Now, having said that, once again, I would urge all of us that are involved somehow in the evolution of the U.S. and the world and trying to figure out how to best position ourselves in that evolution, to think deeply as to what this means. The fact that Walmart is present in Mexico does not damage in any way, shape, or form what it does in the States. It builds the strength of Walmart. The fact that we have part of the automotive industry migrating to Mexico is because of the fact that they have migrated from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt over the past 80 years. It's been happening, well, not 80, for the past 50 years. It's been happening. What do you see because of that? You see bolstered competitiveness for the automotive industry in the U.S. vis-a-vis Japan, South Korea, China, and others, and Europe. How can you take out those factors and conclude that, oh my gosh, I mean, they've gone to Mexico? That is not true. Take a look at manufacturing. We have lost in the world jobs to manufacturing over the past, 30 years, because of technology. But if you see the downslide of manufacturing jobs in the U.S., it's not only parallel to that, it's an improvement, meaning we're not sliding as fast as the world overall, meaning we're gaining in manufacturing to a certain extent. What's the conclusion out of that? Well, you don't say, I'm going to stop the world and I'm going to keep my jobs in coal mining or in this or that. That would be wonderful, but it won't happen. What do we do instead? Okay, so how do we build our strengths in terms of competitiveness to make sure that 21st century business prospers in the U.S. and stays in the U.S. and grows in the U.S.? That's the challenge. That is the challenge. When you say, let's make America great again, I mean, I've been either living in the States or connected to the States. My father was a Notre Dame graduate in the New Rockney years, so that gives you a sense of how far my roots reach. I can't depict a particular moment in time where you could say this was an amazing country vis-a-vis today. It's always been amazing. It's always been great. We have some challenges today. Needless to say, we've always had challenges. Where will you go back to? 1958? Well, I can remind you of the Sputnik moment. You know, I was like, oh my God, doomsday. Where you go back to 1965, yes, we were in the race to the moon, but by the same token, complicated civil rights issues. Where do you go back to? Early 1970s, Watergate. Where do you go back to say, this is the greatest moment of America, we're going back to that? This is the greatest moment of America. Let me just take a digression here, if I may, for 1 minute. We were just mentioned with Bill earlier today. 180 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville, traveled to America. He was a French philosopher and writer, great man, a Renaissance man in his own right. And he wrote Democracy in America. And he published in 1836 and 1840, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, in that decade. And back then, this was a young nation. And we're coming out of a number of dire challenges. And we were up to dire challenges ahead, including civil war. But what he said back then was, because of the energy, the vitality of townships, because of the way that local communities and local life and civic engagement and philanthropy and the way that citizenship is practiced, this is going to be the best nation in the world. And he was absolutely right. When I took my oath, I became a U.S. citizen years ago. Jeb Bush, by chance, was having dinner in San Antonio, and I was invited. And a mutual friend introduced us, and he said, oh, you know, Raul just became a U.S. citizen this morning. So Bush, it was before he was governor, said, oh, how was it? And I knew his brother well, George W., President Bush. So I said, you know, your brother knows that I'm in the process of doing this. But let me tell you one fundamental feeling that I felt, and that is, I felt part of what de Tocqueville was talking about 180 years ago. We do not, I travel around the world all the time, and part of what I do because of the foundation I chair is take a look at what's happening in terms of citizenship and civic engagement and the resilience of communities. Nowhere in the world do I see what's happening here. We need to be aware of that because it's alive, it's well, it needs to be, you know, reinforced as much as we can. But that's the element of greatness that I see today in America. So when people tell me, let's make America great again, I'll say, well, you know, it's pretty good. It can be improved, but it's pretty good. The best. Yeah.
I've got a question about border security and the Border Patrol. As you know, the case was just before the Supreme Court about the cross-border shooting. And it seems like the Border Patrol found, or was a very responsive element to some of Trump's rhetoric. Mm-hmm. You know, in the U.S., we've had difficulties recently with police forces and their interactions with people of color. Does that concern you at all, how the Border Patrol resonates with what Trump's saying, and do you have insights into why that might be?
No, all the way back to when Silvestre Reyes was the head of Border Patrol in El Paso, I've been close to the Border Patrol. I've done maybe 3 visits with them in terms of being on the ground and doing the rounds. It's a thankless job. It's very complicated. I mean, we tend to pick the moments where they overdo and where, you know, they go beyond their duty and in a negative sense. But we neglect the daily experience. And it's not only challenging from a security standpoint, from a human standpoint, it hits you. The number of young Central Americans who have walked and rode ungodly means of transportation, including on top of the railroad, from Chiapas to the border, risking their lives on many, many occasions, either losing limbs or dying in the process, being raped, assaulted, you name it. It hits you. I don't know if you've done it, but you know, it gives you a different sense of what the Border Patrol is up to in terms of their tasks, their jobs. I don't blame them for reacting very positively to some of the things that President Trump said, including, you know, let's reinforce the patrol and better equip technologically. My first reaction, if I were a Border Patrol member, it would be, yeah, I want a wall here too, you know. But that doesn't mean it's cost effective. That doesn't mean it's the most efficient way to deal with it. So, you know, that's my reaction to their reaction. I try to understand. It's not easy. That doesn't mean that there's some members that do not act the way they should. But overall, I think we're lucky to have the Border Patrol. There's a Border Patrol on the Mexican side. I was a foreign member of the Mexican board of their equivalent of Customs and Border Patrol for a number of years, and I got to see up close the challenges that they faced, not only on our side, but more importantly, in the Chiapas part of the border. And it's depressing, to say the least. It's very difficult. So why are we facing this? Because we're a magnet, number one. Number two, because we have a place for many of them, rather hypocritically, by the way, because we take advantage of some of the benefits, and then we say, oh, you know, you're illegal. Well, yeah, but in the meantime, he or she has been working in the kitchen in the restaurant, or picking fruit in the fields, or what have you. So we're not exactly consistent on this side of the border in that regard, and not exactly fair. Let me wrap up this answer with one thing. If you ask me, out of the initiatives out there, of people that are engaged in the bilateral relationship from a government and business and civic standpoint, what would I say stands out? It's a temporary worker program that was designed by a group that was put together by Carlos Gutierrez, who was George W. Bush's Secretary of Commerce, former chairman of Kellogg Corporation, and Ernesto Zedillo, who in my view is the most respected former president alive in Mexico today, and a group of very interesting bipartisan folks from the US and from Mexico. And it's, you remember the Bracero program in the 40s and 50s all the way to the 60s, that was abusive in many ways. This is a worker program that would work, and that would take care of two sides of that particular component of the equation, meaning people getting jobs where they're needed and where they do not displace people, and where they benefit, for example, agriculture in the US. Over 50% of workers in the ag sector in the US are undocumented. We know that. We've known that for years. Suddenly say, oh my goodness, well, you know, to begin with, who's going to take those jobs? You hear a lot of voices in Kansas saying, we need more of that. We need an orderly way of doing this. So this is the solution. Takes care of that need of people getting jobs and jobs needing people. And you take care of the legality of it in a proper way, in a way that's fair, that's well managed, that provides the benefits and so forth. And you reestablish something that was broken at least since the beginning of this century, which was a circular movement of people. People coming over, working for some time and going back, and caring of their families and building up a legacy in Mexico. That was broken. It will reestablish that. That's the kind of thing that, if I were President Trump, I would be picking up. I think it would get a lot of support from, needless to say, the business sector and a large portion of the population.
Hi, my name is Cesar Marquez, and I'm from Laredo, Texas, and I've been in Kansas City for almost 15 years, and I have a small transportation management and logistic business that I work directly with U.S. and Mexico.
Can you speak a bit?
Speak up a little bit,
Yeah, I work with, I own a company and I do U.S. Mexico freight. I'm from Laredo, Texas.
Oh.
I've been in Kansas City for 15 years, so I'm an implant to the area.
A Texas expat.
Yes. My question is why have we not educated the general public more about how really NAFTA was implemented? Because that's, you know, that's one of the things that most people think that it was put in place in industries, you know, when there actually was like segments that were protected for many years before they were actually fully implemented.
That was the question I was asking. I mean, why haven't we done more of that, and why haven't we done more of the retraining, readapting to new circumstances? Beats me. I mean, we were complacent, quite frankly. Talk to my friends who are benefiting the most from NAFTA, and I asked them, why haven't you been more vocal about this? Took it as a given, I guess. It's happening, it's working, why mess with it? And to a certain extent, you know, there's always anti-NAFTA feelings, you know, maybe it's a small portion of the population, but it's alive, and people trying to avoid getting into any kind of confrontation. But once again, today, they're all concerned. Well, this has worked, and we shouldn't lose it. So my bet is we're going to hear more of the positives of the relationship. Thank you.
My question focuses on water. You make a couple statements, and then I'll discuss a little bit and ask you a question. Water is vital to all known forms of life. Secondly, all economic activities depend on water directly or indirectly. And thirdly, water can kill in floods and when it's polluted. The United States and Mexico shares two rivers, the Colorado River and the Rio Grande. I want to think about these two in terms of the river basins, the land area that each of these rivers drain. What is being done in terms between Mexico and the United States in governing or managing the water in these two river basins?
Not enough. Thank you for your question. Not enough. I spent 10 years of my life mostly doing financing of water, wastewater, and infrastructure in general. What you find along the border, and by the way, we don't even agree on the name of the river, or one of the rivers. It's Rio Bravo or Rio Grande, depending on where you are. But what you find on the bilateral side of things is that we're still dealing with scarce resources that we share. In the way we dealt with them, as I mentioned before, in the 1940s. The SILA IBWC structure scheme that we have for managing water and other resources on a bilateral level are both based on sovereign principles, meaning they follow the dictates and the priorities of Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. If you go to the Great Lakes, it's an entirely different situation. You have the IJC, which is an independent body, for the most, that, number one, takes into account technical concerns, meaning, okay, how are we doing in terms of amount and quality and so forth. That is not the case on the Mexican side. So over the past 20 years, what you've seen when you analyze regional politics, meaning particularly Texas with Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, and Chihuahua, if I had to rank the problems that have been taking most of our time, number one by far would be water, because we don't agree on how to deal with it. And if we don't agree on how to deal with it, then we mismanage it even more than we do usually, we would traditionally do. What do you find on the Mexican side in terms of water? It's particularly bad because the utilities are political sinecures. They're repositories of interests of all kinds, highly politicized, and I dare say quite corrupt. So what you find not only in urban areas where you would think that close to 30% of the water is used, but mostly in the rural areas where you have 70% and beyond of the water use, is tremendous mismanagement for a number of reasons. What we face is not lack of money. In some instances, as the head of a bank, I had sufficient resources to fund projects, but the inability to do it because the projects were not there and the institutions were not ready to take over. We tried to push as much as possible privatization. It didn't work for the same reasons, highly politicized environment. And we had a couple of success stories in Juarez and somewhere else, but that was it. Doesn't work. I'll give you a great example that I remember from my years in dealing with these things. I was dealing with an issue in Piedras Negras and one in Eagle Pass, right across the river. Eagle Pass being a much smaller community, less powerful from an economic business standpoint than Piedras Negras. We had a $4 million project in the Piedras Negras side that it just couldn't fund because, again, we couldn't put it together, mostly because of institutional backwardness. Eagle Pass, $100 million project, like this. That's the issue. That's the fundamental issue. It's a rift in terms of water management capabilities and structures that is crucial in terms of how you deal with the most important environmental problem along the border, which is water.
One more question.
I was just curious, back to talking about having people come in from Mexico on a work visa for a certain project and then go home. Do they pay tax on their wages to the U.S. during the time they're working here?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so they're not citizens.
But they pay.
But by paying tax,
yes.
they're entitled to Medicare or Medicaid, for example.
Yes.
I think that's the rub with a lot of people.
Not Medicaid. Medicaid.
Not
Medicare,
Medicaid.
I'm sorry. Medicaid, yes.
Medicaids, because they wouldn't be able to afford full care on their wages, I wouldn't assume. So they would be eligible for Medicaid, or if they had to go to the hospital, they would be treated at no charge by the hospital, and that cost gets passed on. So isn't that where the rub comes in? I mean, with the citizenry at large thinking, hey, they're, you know.
Except for the fact that they are paying taxes.
Yeah.
Most of them. I mean, again, this is not universal, of course, but if that's the kind of thing that we would fix by having a formal program, like the one that I was mentioning that was put together by Cedillo and Gutierrez.
Okay.
In a legal framework, you can make sure that from a fiscal standpoint, things are okay, and from a services standpoint, things are okay.
Okay.
If not, we have a mess. But once again, the issue is that we're enjoying, quote unquote, the fact that we have the kind of agricultural production that we have. And the thing that we neglect to either acknowledge or know or understand is that over 50% of that is being produced by undocumented. Let's fix that.
And undocumented don't pay taxes.
In those instances, yes, because it's withheld.
With the new program?
No, the current situation.
Oh.
Yeah. There's some research that's been done recently in UCLA. I'm not an expert in that field at all, but it just ran across an individual, a professor from UCLA that did a study in terms of undocumented paying taxes. And it's a substantial portion, apparently. I mean, obviously, it's approximation, but from what I hear, either because it's been withheld by the employer or by other means, there's a level of strong contribution in terms of taxes. I don't know if you have the same information, Christina.
I've heard estimations, but they're just estimations, so.
But along the same lines?
Yes, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Can I add a comment to that?
Yeah.
Most undocumented citizens that work in the U.S., they have to have a social security number.
Yeah.
Or e-verify.
Mm-hmm.
So either they use a fake social security number or somebody else's identity, that therefore that's how taxes are being taken out.
Exactly right.
They're not necessarily not paying any taxes. The system is, in effect, rigged because you have to go ahead and have a social security number to be able to operate.
Yeah, that is true. Mm-hmm.
So I think, oh, all right, I'm getting the wrap it up. So I'd like to thank you all. Raul, first off, thank you so much for coming to Lawrence, Kansas and sharing your insights with us. Thank you all for coming today. Our fifth and final session will be July 11th. With the guest will be Alan Burson, who
Dear friend.
you know
Wonderful.
quite
Don't miss
well.
it. It's going to be a lot better.
And everyone.
And that's a Tuesday, not a
Yes, it's a Tuesday. So everyone have a wonderful 4th of July, and I hope to see you all on the 11th.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate it. Thanks.